Hi, I've already recorded today's session, but I'm coming back to do this prequel as we approach the end of our course this term. Today we will be looking at session goal planning, and Thursday when I meet with you, we will review your thinking about your session goals for your client. But I wanted again to kind of I wanted to comment on the two things that really motivate me to engage with intervention planning to the extent and depth to which I've really engaged with it over the years. There are two things really that draw me to the process and that make it for me so valuable. The first is related to goal planning and reflecting upon and engaging in intervention planning encourages me to consider and think about what languages and those components of language that I'm targeting or that I'm considering targeting given my client's needs. And over the years, I've certainly found that to be that focus on trying to understand what really the language system is, and has really opened my eyes to its complexity, and ultimately to its status, ultimately as an aspect of mind function, analogous to cognition, and having a universal, relational, generative foundation, one that I to this day reflect upon and try to really understand, and that is a challenge, and it's not just a challenge for me, but a challenge for the research community in general. And we're actually fortunate enough to be in a profession where we can reflect upon and engage in this entire process of understanding language, and we actually try to affect it as we plan our long and short-term goals and our session goals and procedures as we address clients and try to really affect the language system. The other component of all of this is once I think about and come to develop some ideas about what language is or the components that I'm focusing on, of course, phonology, morphology, syntax, semantics, whatever my primary focus or foci are, I then have to ask the question, how is this stuff acquired? How are these things acquired? How do children acquire this amazing ability that we recognize as speech and language? How do adults who have challenges in the area of reacquire skills that they may have lost, competencies that may be either suppressed or somehow compromised? What processes account for the acquisition, particularly again of this mind function business, of language as a function of an aspect of mind function? And the answers to that question also are complex and extremely interesting, challenging, and that's what makes the entire intervention planning process so engaging. The enterprise, that's what I was going to say, the intervention planning enterprise and the assessment enterprise, by the way. They're two sides of a coin. I know you're taking this class with your PRAC 2 or 3, which is a diagnostic focused practicum. Well, diagnostics and assessment and treatment planning are really two sides of a coin. And you have really the challenge and the opportunity to deepen your understanding about what language is how it's acquired as you work to address your client's needs. So I'm going to stop my little prequel at this point and turn to session planning, and we'll explore this in greater depth when I see you on Thursday. Goal is an act of learning, as Professor Klein and myself see it, an act of learning leading to the acquisition of the behavior targeted as the short-term goal and ultimately the long-term goal. Keyword, act of learning. That is quite different from our perspective on the short-term and long-term goals, where those were generative relational aspects of language that underlie functional communication. But the question is raised once we establish generative targets, how are they acquired or rehabilitated in the case of an adult or a client who has had language established already and is trying to reestablish or access that language? What kinds of learning take place? That leads to a different, an additional set of information or sources of information to guide us in goal planning. The long and short-term goals were guided by, of course, baseline data on the client's, given the client's language functioning. But in addition to that, a taxonomy that outlines the components of language that is being targeted and the levels of complexity or organization, typically developmental levels, that would, again, allow us to establish a long-term target and have a systematic, evidence-based foundation for sequencing goals, making a decision as to what linguistic structure to target first, second and third, etc. As we establish short-term goals, and of course that could apply to session goals as well, on the road to achieving the long-term behavioral objective, the long-term goal. But then we immediately ask ourselves the question, well, how's the client going to learn this material, acquire this aspect of language or this ability to make these relationships? Or how is the client going to rehabilitate? What processes contribute to the rehabilitation of these linguistic structures? And that is another set of information. That leads to other sets of information that will guide our planning. And by the way, I just want to highlight that when you create your management plan, you don't only identify your goals, but you and the procedure. You indicate what information has guided that planning, and that information, of course, has to be research-based information. So for the long and short-term goals, again, that information was contained in developmental or complexity-based structural taxonomies, which indicated the aspect of speech and language that was being comprised the area being targeted, and the components of that and how they developed, in what order they developed, so that we could, in addition to establishing a long-term objective, conceptualize how to sequence and establish short-term objectives. But now again, we're at the session level of planning. So what decisions, first of all, do we have to make at the session level? Well, first we have to actually prioritize short-term goals to establish a sequence of session goals to address over the semester. We have to make a decision. which short-term goals that we've established should we target first, and then second and third, etc., during a particular semester, because we're going to be sequencing session goals to get at those short-term goals that we've established. And then we need to create clinician-mediated activities that promote acts of learning leading to the achievement of the targeted short-term goals. Those will be contexts, activities, tasks for the client that we clinicians design that, and as I probably have mentioned already and will develop further, that includes the non-linguistic context, the materials, the furniture, how the client is positioned, etc. Everything surrounding the behavior that's non-linguistic. The linguistic context will be that we will be designing is the way we as clinicians will be interacting with the client. So we have to learn the decision we have to make is to identify and control, to create a non-linguistic and linguistic context, and then to identify and control performance demands related to these contexts. What do I mean by performance demands? You're going to be tweaking your goals to make them a little more, these activities for the client, to make them more less complex or more complex, less difficult or more difficult for the client. And that means finagling with, managing the non-linguistic context, how you, what materials and how you're going to be presenting them, and the complexity of the task you give the client. And also how complex and what kinds of communications you're going to be directing to the client during the session. We'll develop that further as we go along. How does a session goal differ from a long or short-term goal? Again, a session goal is an act of learning. An act of learning does not necessarily incorporate generative functional communication. It can be a skill that's acquired. It can be a specific therapy activity of one sort or another. Long and short-term goals, on the other hand, always need to reference generative, functional, relationship-based communication structures. And I think I reviewed this with you in class. This is the format we'll be writing session goals in. Client will do something observable, given something that the client will be engaged with physically or in another way, but non-linguistically speaking, materials, trying to achieve a particular task of one sort or another. And linguistic context, given a linguistic, something non-linguistic that the client will be engaged with, and a kind of communication that the client will be engaged with, and a criterion for achieving the objective. And again, I think in class I pointed out in examples. For example, the last one will produce a simile to describe the taste of a brownie. Given the verbal template, it tastes as good as a, or it tastes as bad as a, 3 times during the session. So the observable behavior there is producing a simile. This is a metalinguistic goal, isn't it? If you remember, it attaches to the short-term goals and the long-term goal connected to this. Produces simile to describe the taste of a brownie. So I didn't say the client will in fact taste the brownie, but this involves a brownie. That's the non-linguistic context. Given the verbal template, it tastes as good as a, or it tastes as bad as a. And I didn't say they're modeled by the clinician or written by the clinician, but that could be added too, 3 times during the session. Another one will produce complex 2-verb temporal demands incorporating before or after to correct the clinician who will attempt to follow a recipe, the brownie recipe. So the non-linguistic material here is the recipe, right? And the linguistic context is the clinician's attempt to follow the recipe, right? Well, let's look at the guiding information here. What will guide session planning are, again, the taxonomies that were used to establish the short-term goal and the long-term goal, plus the considerations in session task design that were identified first in the procedural approach, and then in the operationalizing. So I could not say that, huh? Operationalizing of the procedural approach. And those considerations are the implications of research, and one way of one source of information that you go to establish a session goal is research, clinical research on intervention techniques that have some support for being effective. And related to that research are theoretic premises about language learning and rehabilitation. And also what will guide you, and you would consider, are the maintaining factors that could be contributing to the problem and that need to be addressed. And they're going to be addressed at the session level in the context you create for the client. It's the context that will address cognition, sensory motor factors, psychosocial factors, etc. It's a context design situation. That's the task in front of us. Design a linguistic and non-linguistic context that supports processes that will lead to the acquisition or rehabilitation of linguistic structures targeted as long and short-term goals. We really took a big step towards session planning in operationalizing the procedural approach when we identified the kinds of activities we'll be presenting the client and the kinds of communicative interactions, linguistic interactions we'll engage with our client. And of course, we will, again, the guiding information will include those performance demands that we are going to control by systematically making, recognizing what demands these activities and interactions are having on the clients, and then making it more difficult, less difficult, more complex, less complex, etc., to facilitate acquisition of the targets. Now let's spend a little more time. Let's spend a little time on this idea again of performance demands. And again, a performance demand is some aspect of the context that's created in your session that will challenge the client one way or another. So here we have a table here that represents performance demands that can be manipulated during a session, that will be manipulated as you plan a session. One type of performance demand is the sensory motor perceptual component of the session. So we know from research that children learning language talk more readily when manipulating objects than just observing objects or others doing something. We know that language occurs more frequently with actions present than in the absence of the objects and actions being referenced. That's called perceptual support. Well, to make things easier for a client, that's true probably for adults as well. So if you have the object you're talking about in front of you, well, that could reduce performance demands. If you're talking about something in the past or the future, well, that could increase performance demands, as you can imagine. This morning I was having a conversation with students, and we were talking about a client with aphasia who would maybe use a single verb as a as an session objective, actually, to use a single verb, SVC, single verb sentence, to express that he needed something. I need a fork, perhaps in order to eat a snack that was available. I need a fork. Well, we could have the objects that he needs the fork for either present or not present. If the object that the fork is needed for is present, well, that would make, I think, performance demands a little less intense than if the object was not present, and this piece of silverware, if it was there and modeled by the clinician, held by the clinician, so the client could refer to it, that might make the performance demands less than if say the utensil was mixed up in a container with other utensils, say a knife and a fork and a spoon, or completely absent, period. You following me? That's a sensory, motor, and perceptual support demand. Pragmatic context. Utterances have been found to be more complex when lexical items are familiar, supported by aspects of the adult's prior utterances, that is contingent upon other utterances. There are no new syntactic elements. They're closely aligned to the child's intent. I think I cut that off here. Let me see what that comes on the next one. To the child's actions, or questions to a child that are genuine, not contrived, you see. So you could, again, contextual, if you're working with a child with a language delay, a contextualized question, for example, a question about an object that the child is playing with, perhaps, that you have no idea what it is. Say, what if it's a video game that you're not aware of, don't know about, and you honestly ask the child, well, what's that? Or what game is that you're playing? Well, that's less complex than, say, less of a performance demand than, say, asking a child a completely decontextualized question, such as, what causes rain? What causes rain, or something like that. I can't think of anything more intelligent to say in terms of a question, but you see the difference there. Not to mention, of course, that one is by the way, one of those questions is simply requesting an object name about an object, a video game being used right then and there, while the other is a causal question, which is more complex, right? So the complexity of the questioning shifted, right? If I said, man, cool hat, and the child or then says, oh, I got the hat at SneakerCon. My son is going to SneakerCon this weekend. Well, the fact that I mentioned hat, or did you get the hat at SneakerCon, and the child says, yeah, I'm going to go to SneakerCon this weekend, by referencing the word to the vocabulary to begin with, that is a support in a sense. It makes the child's response less challenging than if I didn't mention one of those words that the child picked up and used, for example, or an adult in a conversation, if you're following me. Those are tweaking. Those are things that tweak the session, that make the session more or less complex. The task that the individual is engaged with, more or less complex. So providing the supports when first introducing a speech-language target, a model utterance, avoiding using questions, reduce performance demands, making questions natural and context supported, reduces performance demands. Moving on to some additional performance demands. My son was just calling me in the background. You may have heard a little bit of that. So I have dealt with that issue, and moving on here now. Another aspect of performance, another area that we could control or think about controlling performance demands, think about as a performance demand, is in the area of executive functions. The cognitive, semantic, syntactic, lexical, and morphological complexity of problem-solving procedures that individuals are presented verbally or in text. Often kids are verbally asked to think about another way to word a paragraph or organize a story or solve a math problem, etc. Well, whatever the cognitive, semantic, syntactic, lexical, and morphological demands of a particular task, whether the task requires what level of reasoning the task requires, whether it's pre-operational reasoning, operational reasoning, etc. Those are demands that, those are task demands that can be manipulated in designing the task you're engaging the client in. The number of individual linguistic items the individual has to recall. For example, on the self-test, the sentence imitation or sentence retrieval or recall, whatever that subtest is called. Well, the sentence can be very short, it can be longer, it can be more or less complex, etc. A story that one has to retell after hearing. Often these stories that kids are tested on or which are targeted in session have lists of items that the child or adult is challenged to recall. For example, in the test of narrative language, the very first subtest is a McDonald's story about a children who go to this McDonald's with their mom who forgets the money to pay at McDonald's, and the kid is asked, and in the course of telling the story, the children are given a list of items that each of the client is given a list of items that each of the kids who go to McDonald's order, including the mom. A Big Mac, shake, fries, a salad, etc. Well, I myself, as you know, have memory issues. I cannot recall these lists of items, and the more items, the more performance demand, and the more decontextualized the items, the more they're just a memory task as opposed to a comprehension task. The more that's the case, I've got problems. So that's an example of a performance demand. How many items one has to remember or recall. Transparency of figurative language is another aspect of performance demands in the domain of executive functions. Familiarity with the lexical items and figurative expressions in terms of past, whether they're culturally appropriate or not. Well, the experience with the items will make them easier or more difficult, if you're following me. And these are just some things. Another aspect of performance demands is the level, I always think about, the level of information processing being engaged so that problem-solving tasks that involve the manipulation of concrete objects, that allow the client to think about a non-symbolic, there's a non-symbolic component of the activity, such as for actually making brownies by mixing, having the ingredients there and mixing the ingredients, etc. Actually making a brownie with the manipulation of physical objects includes some objects that are not as symbolic as or semiotic as a recipe that is simply written on cards, so involves simply written materials. I apologize for the dogs in the background. Or a recipe that's verbally presented to the client that the client has to recall and follow. Well, verbally or textually presented material is at the symbolic level or the executive level, whereas physically mixing objects, well, that's sensory motor, less symbolic material, yes? Well, I would think the material would reduce performance demands. Purely linguistic processing or executive processing increases the complexity of the task and increases performance demands. Now, when you're designing session goals, sometimes you want to increase the complexity. Sometimes you want to decrease the complexity. Sometimes you want to increase the familiarity with material. You want culturally and experientially familiar materials. But sometimes you want to actually increase the difficulty. More novel, less familiar material. Culturally different material. As long as you do it intentionally, you are doing your job in designing the session objective. However, if you don't think about these things and just throw material at the client, or goals, behaviors, and off the top of your head design context, without systematically thinking through the features of the activity that contribute to the complexity or contribute to the difficulty, and don't systematically regulate those components. The more you do the regulation, you're doing your job and doing a better job in designing session goals. And the more you overlook things, the more is open to just chance. And we want to avoid chance as much as we can. So we'll be writing the session goals so that they integrate the behavioral target, context, and criterion for achievement, frequency of performance, and I like trial ratios myself, or frequency. So I'll say to achieve a particular, to use a simile, two times per session. Or I'll say produce the k sound in final position of a final syllable position. 8 out of 10 trials. I like trials. I do not like accuracy statements personally, like 80% accuracy. Now, I understand 8 out of 10 trials is 80%. I get it. But why do I like trials? Because accuracy, sometimes clinicians, we just memorize the number and just throw it out without really giving it much thought. And the term trial, we understand, is an actual cycle which begins with some kind of an antecedent, a context that initiates the behavior, and then some kind of a consequence, so that's a trial. We can count and chart trials, 1, 2, 3, 4. We can actually keep records, and we definitely want to chart. We want to keep data, record data. So if you say 10 trials, you can actually do an activity with the client. Whether, by the way, trials work for play type intervention, or a more naturalistic conversational intervention, or they work in adult-directed interventions. You can tell the client to do something and do 8 to 10, 8 trials or 10 trials or whatever. Or you can engage, say you're facilitating the use of a particular content form interaction in a play context. Well, you keep your mind on trying to get the client to produce the content form interaction, so you maybe introduce materials intentionally or make comments intentionally to try to provoke or promote or require a particular response. That's, in all cases, that's pushing trials. I like the term trials, because what we should be doing in session is getting the client to produce the target behavior as frequently as we can, right? Because that's that's the way they learn. That's the way they are going to be, or rehabilitate, reacquire a behavior that may have been lost. I like trial statements, personally. So we write, child will do something, as I said before, given a non-linguistic context and linguistic context and an achievement criterion. If this was presented in a format that that I like using, is called PlayPosit, then you would have these little questions to answer. But please, by now, please think a little bit about what that difference is between a session goal, active learning, and both long and short-term goals, functional communication, in incorporating a relational generative aspect of language or speech, the thing you're targeting, whatever that might be. Now we are going to, in the part 2 of this, let me run through quickly the LC considerations in session goal planning. Remember, we had the short-term goals, the following short-term goals. LC will produce temporal chain explanatory narratives containing conjunctions before, after, until, to direct the clinician in context of problem-solving tasks. Conditional causal content form interactions using appropriate conjunctions, if then unless otherwise, while engaging in problem-solving tasks. Conditional causal, temporal chain explanatory narratives, and similes to describe attributes of objects manipulated in context of a problem-solving task. Those were the short-term goals. Now I'm going to develop the LC. I'll give you the background on the justification for the LC goals, and then I will see you in class when we will turn to your goals and procedures. So we keep in mind, of course, that we were using what developmental taxonomies we were using, the Leahy content form use and narrative taxonomies, Nippold's metalinguistic executive function taxonomy, Best and Miller executive function taxonomy, and Piaget's cognition taxonomy. We wanted to consider implications of research on language learning and related theoretic premises. So this is very important. You must justify your session procedures. And the justification will be against, both with reference to research on, clinical research on the kinds of learning activities or processes and activities, intervention procedures that have some evidence that they work, that they lead to an objective, A, and B, the learning principles connected to these kinds of interventions. So constructivist implications, remember we ran through this first in operationalizing the procedural approach. And we started thinking of these premises and their implications at the long-term level when we established a procedural approach. So we revisit them again at the session level. The session goal as an act of learning is really supported by, guided by our beliefs, supported by research of how acquisition or rehabilitation, what processes contribute to acquisition or rehabilitation. So to facilitate representation of temporal event relations, the constructivist principles would lead us to engage the child in problem-solving activities with concrete objects, encourage the client to communicate about intent, about objects being manipulated, problem-solving procedures, and temporal event relations. We're thinking about the temporal long-term goal. Implications continued. So we're going to be creating problem-solving activities with concrete objects that involve temporal event relations. We're also going to think about employing social cognitive premises, implications of the social cognitive premises or processes. And that social cognitive scaffolding suggests that we model verbal or text-based linguistic forms The sentences themselves that we're targeting, or vocabulary, rules, and scripts for the client to represent and apply to familiar and novel situations. We're going to model what we want the client to acquire. We want to consider performance demands. We want, and they will be, one thing we want is, in this case, is developmentally temporal appropriate. I see that's left out. Developmentally appropriate temporal semantic relations. Developmentally, I see, sorry. I'm misreading my own slide. Developmentally, temporal semantic relations precede causal. So by targeting temporal before causal, we are, in a sense, controlling performance demands. We're making our initial session target less complex. Speaking about objects that are present and being manipulated present less cognitive demand than speaking about an event in the past or future. Now, let me say, this reminds me, what is the guiding you here in terms of, again, procedure planning, are the session goal planning, and which derives again from procedure planning as I see it, in addition, of course, to the goal planning that was established. In the procedure planning, what's guiding us is first, again, these theoretically based premises and the implications from them derived from the research, and also the implications of the performance demands, not performance demands, the implications of the maintaining factors. In this case, there's a cognitive maintaining factor that's playing out in this LC's, that's contributing to LC's performance. So we want to address cognition in designing context, and again, the cognitive demand is either going to increase or decrease the challenge for the client. So we're going to have objects that are present and being manipulated. I could also say that he seems to have some issues when he is both concentrating on the, say, on a picture sequence and talking about something. So we're using objects being manipulated here. So our session goals is to produce a temporal, as we've reviewed before, a temporal chain explanatory narrative to describe a recipe for making microwave brownies one time during a session. We'll produce complex two-verb temporal commands, incorporating before or after to correct me, who will be attempting, or the clinician will attempt to follow the recipe. I could have written using concrete materials. So explaining, that increases performance demand, it seems to me, as I look at it here right now, because he's going to be verbally communicating to the clinician the recipe, and then while I'm following his directions, I will mess up and or perhaps act confused to support his explanation to me before doing this, do that, or after you do this, do that, if you're following me. Now, I could say produce a temporal chain explanatory narrative to describe a recipe. I'm just looking at that goal as I wrote it here for making microwave brownies. I could say given a written recipe, maybe he'll read it. Do I want that? Or did I want him to, thinking of performance demands, just, or maybe index cards, you know how you make notes on index cards, step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, without, and I don't like step directions, but I do recognize that represents a temporal narrative. So I could say given perhaps the goal would have been better written if I had stated, given index cards with the sequence or steps, the terms that we try to avoid here actually, the time sequence of acts to make steps in making a microwave brownie, then that would have perhaps provided some reduced performance demands a bit. Maybe he's being asked to simply remember the recipe. That could have been specified a little better if you're thinking. What I'm doing is thinking out loud about how to manipulate the performance demands here and how to be perhaps a bit more specific in describing either the linguistic context or the non-linguistic. In this case, linguistic. Whether I would provide, like, should I provide, index cards with steps of the recipe, or pictures to follow? That's a good question, which causes issues for him, and then I have to consider, well, is he been able to create the narrative? Will he simply be describing picture by picture by picture, or generating the narrative? If I have picture by picture by picture, it won't perhaps be a narrative. It's just a series of individual sentences describing the picture, which Elsie has a tendency to do when he's asked to tell a story. So perhaps after modeling or presenting a series of cards, maybe I would remove them and have him recall the narrative, which I think is why I wrote it without the cards. I'm thinking out loud here, but this is intentionally to give you a sense of where the goals come from and what are the considerations here. Last one will produce a simile to describe the taste of the brownie, given the verbal template. It tastes as good as, or it tastes as bad as, 3 times during the session. Now, the implication here, we're actually making brownies. So following the baking of a brownie, I could have written Elsie will produce, but I think that's a little too specific. I think you get it. I think this does pick up the non-linguistic context, a brownie there, and the linguistic, a verbal template. Modeled, I could say modeled by the clinician, or it tastes as bad as a, modeled by the clinician, but perhaps the clinician would model it beforehand and give the client Elsie instructions, and the goal is to produce the simile to describe the taste given the verbal template. And that's reflection, right? One or more session goals, blah, blah, blah. So what I'm going to, again, I have available for you a MK slip that is didn't come out too well here, that provides an outline of what are the decisions that you need to make to establish session goals, and the information that guides you for justification purposes. You can use these, by the way, for your final project, to guide you in your final project, and we will address this specifically with reference to your specific clients this Thursday in class. And if you attach these things to, by the way, if you do attach your in-process management plans, I will look at them and give you feedback. I know I have to check NYU, my NYU email, not just the LIU. LIU is liu.edu, NMOS is at liu.edu. NYU is, I think, Nelson. Now I forget if it's NMoses or Nelson Moses at NYU.edu, or if it's NM103. I think it's NM103 at NYU.edu. Got to check that out. See you Thursday.